Welcome to Wildflower, from Wildflower, Rooted and Reckless, the podcast where writer and storyteller Angela Walker creates space to bloom in the wildest places, sharing stories of grit, grace, and growth.
Hello, my friends. This is Wildflower from Wildflower, Rooted and Reckless podcast. My name is Angela Walker. And now that we finally hit record on that introduction episode, it is time to dive right in. I'm going to start with my story. As things progress, I will be inviting people on, guests on, ordinary, everyday people to come and share their stories, because what is the most beautiful about a field of wildflowers is how different they all are. Different colors, different sizes and shapes, and yet they all bloom. So that really inspired me as I started thinking about my friends and acquaintances, people I've met along the way. I've thought this person's story would touch so many people and they need a platform to tell it. And enters Wildflower. Today, I am sharing probably the most life-shaping portion of my story. It starts when I was just 18 years old. I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, eager to take on the world, thought I knew everything, wondered why my parents dared to hold me back, and learned the hard way. I mentioned last time I was around 16, 17 years old, a little rebellious, a little boy crazy. I was in a relationship with a guy who was a little bit older than me. And when I was 18 years old, I turned up pregnant, wearing the birth control patch and all. So I was quite shocked to find out that I was with child. And it definitely was not something I was prepared for in life, nor did I necessarily want in life. The irony to this is I thought it was something I wanted in life. I had been with my partner then for 2 years, I want to think, just around there. I had graduated high school and we had an apartment and I thought I was a big girl. Friends around us had kids and they would argue everywhere we went. There was a lot of bickering and it seemed like a lot of work and a lot of hassle. At that point, I was like, just kidding. I don't want to have a baby. Seems one star, do not recommend right now. And so that's where I was at. And surprise, I was pregnant. My partner was not thrilled at all. He felt that there were other options. I did not share that belief. I am pro-life 100%. So that was going to be a big no for me. And he knew that. So pretty early on in my pregnancy, we actually separated and I moved back in with my parents. And at some point, I had a blood test that came back positive for spina bifida. And I was scared. Obviously, I was young. I mean, it doesn't matter what age you are, you're going to be scared about that. We had friends that either were pregnant at that time also or had just had their babies. And they were like, listen, our test came back positive for that as well. It ended up being nothing. It's a false positive. That's going to happen. They're going to take a lot of blood and do a lot of tests, and there's going to be scary moments, but everything's fine. You're young. You're healthy. There's no reason to think anything other than this baby is perfectly fine. At the time, I had gotten a job at a ice cream place, and it was kind of like a lunchy deli ice cream place. And I didn't tell him I was pregnant. I was only a couple months pregnant when I got the job. I didn't tell him I was pregnant because I didn't think that they would give me the job. And I was doing a really good job of hiding it. There was a couple comments made about how much ice cream I was eating and gaining weight, which was ironic because I did not crave ice cream at all. I craved their sandwiches and their salads, ironically. But my secret was safe with me. So I had scheduled a ultrasound. I had to schedule an ultrasound. So I go in for this ultrasound and I've heard great things about the place. And The ultrasound tech is like stone faced, stoic, not giving away anything. They walk out of the room. The doctor comes in and he's like, good news is it's not spina bifida. Bad news is it's gastroschisis, which is a physical birth defect. And if all goes well, they'll do surgery when he's born. Everything goes right. He'll come home, no problems. And I was just in shock. In shock. I didn't know what any of the words were that he was saying out of his mouth at that moment. But he did tell me I needed an amnio, and he wanted me to schedule an appointment to do that. And I was like, can you do it today? Because I've already taken the time off work. Work doesn't know. And could we just go ahead and do that today? And so he reluctantly agreed. He's like, usually we need time to process these things. And I'm like, what am I going to do about it? I don't even know what you're saying right now, to be honest with you. So at this point, we just need to do the thing so we can move on with this. And so he agreed. And so he did the amnio and he sent it in for confirmation. And sure enough, it came back that my baby had gastroschisis. Really what that meant at that time was just a lot of ultrasounds, high risk pregnancy, just kind of following along. At that time, 3D ultrasound had come out. So everybody was super excited to use that to measure like how much of his intestines were out and how big the hole was. And I think at some point it kind of counted against me, but in the interim, it was nice to get to see all of the pictures. At some point, my amniotic fluid started getting low and they started hospitalizing me. I would say like the last month or so of my pregnancy, I was in the hospital a lot, like a lot. At around 34 weeks-ish, I want to say, they started getting concerned that the intestine was swelling and the 3D ultrasounds were showing things that just gave them a lot of concerns, and they felt that it was time for a C-section. So they did another amnio to make sure that his lungs were developed, and then, or at least give them an idea of where they were. And we went through a round of steroids to help everything kind of grow quickly before he came to the world. And then she called me and said, okay, on December 24th, we've got a C-section scheduled. And I was like, no, he cannot have a birthday on Christmas Eve, especially when we get to pick it, like, especially when we're scheduling something. And I called her like every day with 10 reasons why we should not have a C-section on Christmas Eve. But long story short, I lost that battle, and Christmas Eve it was. Cody was born on Christmas Eve via C-section, and it was super scary. I was obviously 19 years old. My mom was there, thankfully. By this point, Cody's dad and I had reconciled, and he was there as well. I had a C-section and gave birth to a 6-pound, 5-ounce, otherwise healthy baby boy who had a very minor case of gastroschisis. It ended up being about a 3-centimeter hole. He had about a foot of intestine coming out, which in the grand scheme of things is super, super minor. So with gastroschisis, these kids will have like a grapefruit size hole. And then the pressure from being in utero will actually start to push out their organs. So their stomach, their small and large intestine, kidneys, liver, all the things can come out. And then essentially, sometimes this all has to be put back in the body over time. They actually have to hang a silo up, and then they have to silo the insides of the baby back inside the baby slowly so that if things can stretch and move and accommodate. But for Cody, it was a foot of intestine in a 3-centimeter hole. And so essentially they took their finger and just tucked it back in. And then when they sewed it up, they actually made his hole look like his belly button, because he didn't have a belly button. Like, he didn't have an umbilical cord. I mean, all that, he didn't have any of that when I didn't have to wait for that to fall off or anything like that. Yeah, they sewed it up, made it look like a belly button, a super minor case. So after my C-section, I go to recovery, and then I go to a room. I knew that Cody was going to be transported to a children's hospital nearby for surgery and to be taken care of. Before they left, they actually came into the room so that I could see him and say bye. And that was so hard. That was so hard. There was so many bells and whistles and alarms going off, and he was so tiny, and he was just wrapped in this gauze. You couldn't see what was going on under there. He's just wrapped in this gauze and masks and tubes, and it was just so much. It was just so much. And they were talking about his heart, and they were talking about his breathing, and they were talking about his intestines, and they were talking about all these things and all these issues. And they didn't know when I would get an update because there were so many things that had to be sorted through. And I held it together, and I, thanked them and okay. And I kissed his little transport bassinet, and they took him away. And I remember just sobbing, like just starting to sob. And I was just so upset. I couldn't believe it. I didn't think that I was going to see him again. I thought, how does something that small survive that? I drifted in and out. I'd just been through major surgery, obviously. I drifted in and out. Some family and friends came by to see me and say hi. Some of my family and some of Dad's family went to the children's hospital so that they could be there and see him as much as they could. I remember I woke up and I was just bawling my eyes out, and I didn't know what to do. And there was a woman from housekeeping, and she was quietly just cleaning up the room a little bit. She apologized, and I said, "No, it's okay. It's okay." She came over and she said, "Can I pray with you?" And I was like, "Yeah, please do. Please do." So she held my hand and she prayed with me, and I didn't understand half of what she said, except for in the end, she said amen. And I said amen as well. And my phone rang. I mean, I don't know that we had even finished the word amen. And my phone rang. And it was the hospital. And they had received Cody. And they had gotten him all checked in and set up. And I started asking about his heart and his liver and these things. And they said, "Oh my gosh, we're so sorry. The transporter had the wrong chart. No, Cody's fine. It's just the gastroschisis. He's doing great. He is on a vent. He had to get a little bit of oxygen. He is a little bit premature, but otherwise he is doing fantastic." And I just took this huge breath. I couldn't help but just kind of laugh a little bit, God's glory over and over again. And so I closed my eyes. I went back to sleep. It was a rough night. So typically when you're in the hospital like that and you don't have your baby with you, you're put in a room also with, like, if you have to share a room, it's with somebody who also doesn't have their baby for whatever that reason might be. And so the hospital was just, I guess, overbooked that night. And so in my room was a young woman, but she had her baby. And her baby wanted to be held, and her baby was crying. I remember her screaming at the nurse to get the baby out of there, to take the baby to the nursery. And I remember just thinking, like, "Oh, girl, if you only knew. If you only freaking knew." Oh, I was out, like passed out asleep. And I remember hearing something, and I like barely got my eyes open. And paternal grandma, had taken a picture of Cody at some point and went to Walgreens and had it printed and put it in a frame, and had come back in what I can only assume must have been the middle of the night, and secretly was putting it on my table, on my little hospital table. I remember just reaching up and grabbing it and just holding it so close. And it meant so much to me. It meant so much to me that she did that for me. And then it also meant so much to me to have him with me. That even when I couldn't physically have him, I had some part of him with me, something that I could pray over and be with. And that was just that was everything in that moment. For the first couple weeks while I was still healing from my C-section and Cody was recovering from his surgery, I was getting driven up to the children's hospital each day. So whether that was my mom or my dad or Cody's dad, we were going up to see Cody each day. And because of the timing, oftentimes I was pumping while we were going to see Cody that day. And I'll just never forget, we have to cross the huge bridge. We have to cross the Skyway Bridge, if anybody's familiar with that. Not my favorite. Cannot stand bridges. Do not like them at all. Totally my brain goes wonky when I'm trying to go over a bridge. So that was a whole nother thing. The irony in that was like the cherry on top. But I will never forget like my mom stopping to pay the toll and I'm just sitting there with my boob pumps just and it was those little moments, those tiny glimmers of normalcy and silliness and just having to laugh at like the weirdness of it all that really got me through that timeline. When you have a C-section, you're supposed to be in the hospital for a few nights, right? Back then, especially, I think it was like 3 nights minimum. And I wasn't having it. I needed to get out of that hospital because I needed to go see my baby. And the next morning was Christmas morning. So I started pumping immediately. I wanted him to have breast milk when he was able to, eat. I wanted him to have that, especially the colostrum. That was super important to me. Christmas morning came and I had saved up all of my strength because I knew if I stood any chance of getting out of this hospital, I was going to have to prove that I could walk out of the hospital. The doctor came in to do the rounds and I had saved everything I had and I stood up. I had gotten my catheter out in the middle of the night. I don't know how I convinced the nurse to do that, but I did. And then I had stood up and went over to the sink and I was washing out my pump parts and waiting for the doctor like, hi, how are you? Everything's good. Go ahead, sign me out. And she had said if I could get up and walk and was able to use the restroom and not have a catheter, then she would sign me out. She would discharge me. And so I fully expected that and I held her to it. And then I called home. And I was like, hey, I'm ready for somebody to come pick me up. I need a ride up to the children's hospital. And I remember, I think my mom put my dad on the phone and my dad was like, listen, we talked to the nurses. There's a lot of concerns. You just had major surgery. It can be unsafe for you to travel. And I was like, okay. So just somebody make sure they've got the taxi cab money when we get there because I'm leaving. Like I was out. I was getting to my baby. I was going to my baby. I didn't care if I had to walk. I was going to see my baby. And so they knew that. They knew me well enough that they knew that. And they came, my dad came with Cody's dad and they picked me up and we went to the children's hospital. And I just remember being like so scared. I just kept praying. I was just so scared and I kept praying and I didn't know what to expect. Wasn't a huge fan of hospitals. I mean, all of this was so out of my element. So I had such a vanilla life that this was, I don't even know. This was like Rocky. This was Rocky Road. So we got to the children's hospital and we went in and it was really an amazing place. All of the babies were in their bassinets or little incubators and they all had little Christmas decorations on them and gift cards for the parents and just little gifts for the babies. It was all just very welcoming and normal. I'm not sure the word, honestly, to describe that. It brought a sense of normalcy for some reason, just the fact that it was Christmas and there was Christmas stuff. And yes, this horrible, terrible thing is happening in your life. Also, it's still Christmas. know maybe that doesn't make sense on one side, but at the time, it is exactly what I needed. It was just enough of a distraction to take the edge off of the reality of what was happening. By this time, Cody had already had surgery and he was recovering well. And he had 3 days on the vent and I couldn't hold him right away. So I could just sit with him, and I did. And I brought a little picture and just a little like prayer person to put in his bassinet with him. And all I could do is just be with him and pray with him and hope that that was going to be enough, and talk to him and just kind of be there, you know, and pump. I pumped and pumped and pumped and pumped. And so I really struggled not bringing him home. I think that walking out of that hospital, giving birth, and then him being taken was one thing. I was prepared for that. I knew that that was coming, but visiting and then leaving the hospital without him was devastating. It was just devastating. And I remember the first night home, I lived with my parents and Cody's dad in my childhood bedroom. And I started having nightmares. I would hear babies crying in the night and I wouldn't be able to find the baby. And I would wake up clung on to a leg or digging through a comforter or just in a terror. I could hear the baby crying. And I could not find my baby. And I would just wake up out of these nightmares absolutely panicked. And there was nothing I could do about it. I just had to say a prayer and go back to bed and hope that the morning came, you know, or pump. I pumped a lot. You couldn't be scared. You couldn't be scared. When you were walking the streets downtown to get back and forth, you couldn't be scared. When you were calling friends and family for updates, you couldn't be scared. You had to be brave. And that's where we're going to stop for today. With that, we'll wrap up this episode of Wildflower, Rooted and Reckless.
You've been listening to a Wildflower, Rooted and Reckless podcast production with Angela Walker. Catch Wildflower drops on Tuesdays, Rooted on Wednesdays, and Reckless on Thursdays. Subscribe wherever you listen. Stay wild, stay rooted, stay reckless.